And we are live. Hi, everybody. It's been a long time since I've been streaming. Many reasons for that. But as you can see in the background, some of you might recognize this as the cover of well, front and back cover of the Dungeon Master's Guide for Advanced New Dragons First Edition. One of several covers. It's got released in multiple covers. That is, in fact, a fleet, and that is the city of Brass. Um, Stuff that would be expanded upon. I believe that's the city of Brass, uh, and many other in future editions, especially in Planescape. But we're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons and other role playing games, particularly how to prep for a game. Now, I got a message, the discourse, as it were, on Twitter. Yes, I know. I won't mention who said it. The person hasn't given me permission to say it, but they put up the following question: what's your favorite advice to give to a new TTRPG player, tabletop RPG player? And I responded as, nothing exists until it hits the table. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, it means that, well, literally nothing exists prior to it being in the game. And why is that even a good piece of advice? Well, let's start with, I think, a lot of the conceits people have when they talk about prepping for a game and talking about the game. There's a lot of stuff, for example, one of the things I noticed of late, which is sort of been around for a very long time, of course, and even I fell into that trap many moons ago, but it recently sort of moved away from it, is the idea, oh no, the player characters have derailed my plot. I was like, but what plot are you talking about? How could derail something that doesn't or shouldn't even exist? Because we come to the idea of, especially from a game master's point of view, that we have to be prepared, right? We have to have an interesting plots, world building, lore, setting, characters, and form NPCs. They have to have grandiose. The big bad guy has to have grandiose plans about destroying, conquering, altering whatever the universe or the world, etc., etc. And that only puts a lot of pressure on the GM, especially beginner GMs who might be looking at the current edition, which is one of the friendliest editions that went for fifth edition, at least the way it's presented, compared to past editions at least. And it's like, oh my god, I got to do all this work. I don't know if I can pull it off, right? I got to do all this stuff. I got to make sure I got the maps and the encounters and the fights and the powers and the spells and the psychic abilities and the spaceships, and depending on the game, right? I got to have all the stuff, right? And have this engaging plot, and characters have to have these motivations that are deep and stepped in the setting and the cultures and the languages, and like, relax. The problem, I think, it's this approach is more like a director of a play or a movie or a writer, right? That presumes that the only thing you have to do is sort of present the script to the players, as in players, actors up on a stage, and they just have to play it out. But remember that that's not the case, because this is a game. And games, and I pulled something, have two things that defy that idea. One of them is, pick the right guy here first. Well, this random generated numbers, i.e., dice, cards, etc. You cannot predict if somebody's going to roll a critical on their first roll, or roll all ones all night, right? Or whatever dice they use. Usually people use D20s or 2 or 3 or multiple D6s or D8s or whatever, right? You can't predict that. That's the random part of it. So if your adventure hinges on them getting the right clue by doing the right investigation, persuasion, whatever roll, and they don't get it, They don't get the clue, and the plot is falling apart, right? The other part, of course, is called something called player agency, meaning that you're not the only player on the table. I think one of the else ideas is that GMs are not players. Yeah, you are a player, and you're a player upon a game, and so you're not the only one. You have a very important role. What people say about the most important role, as you have to take care of everything else other than the player characters care of their own player stories and background and character sheet. But that doesn't mean you're the only one. In fact, you're numbered probably 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to 1, depending how big your gaming group is. And they have their own ideas. It's like, oh, my character would do this, my character would do that. They have their own interest. Now, there's some buying into this, like people get together and they set the outer edges of what they expected to do. Like, say you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, so you're expected to go into a dungeon and slay some dragons. Well, we start with kobolds first. And eventually, you work up to dragons, and then demons, and demon lords, and then demi deities, and whatever. Right? But that's part and parcel of the game, at least in most engagements. Right? You find the monster, you rescue the girl that is in arms, you cast the spells, you take out the magic sword, etc. Go to the dungeon, get the treasure, go back to town, get stronger, and do it again. In other games, like, say, Traveler, the major conceit is that you can play many forms of Traveler, but the major conceit is as a debt runner. As in, you're in debt because you've acquired stakes on a ship, and you owed millions of credits, so you go out into the universe to do missions and get money and pay down the debt and live, right? And go to the next location and so on and so forth, right? So these are built-in conceits into the game system and into the particular game that you're playing. But within that environment, the players are free to choose, within reason. And the limitations are the rules to a degree, but more importantly, each other players, right? What the table will allow. And that can give them tremendous leeway. But if you come with the idea that you're like, oh no, it's my story, and I'm just gifting you the story to you, then yeah, they can easily be derailed if they don't follow, the steps that you set out for. So if that's not the approach, then what is this nonsense about nothing existing before it hits the table? Well, let's go through some prep, right? You create a town. Well, if the players don't visit the town doesn't exist. It exists in your notes, but as far as the table is concerned, they never went there, so it doesn't exist. You create an NPC, say a blacksmith. Well, if they never go to the blacksmith shop to, repair, buy, or sell weapons and armor, whatever, or horseshoes or what have you, that blacksmith doesn't exist. I'm sure. So if nobody even bothers to ask if this town has a blacksmith, people can assume that there's a blacksmith, but until they meet them, they don't exist, right? If they're not told that there's a blacksmith, if they don't ask for a blacksmith, if they don't interact with the blacksmith does not exist. If they never come in contact with the big bad guy, one of their lieutenants, then the big bad guy may be doing whatever they're doing in the background, but it doesn't exist. It's the iceberg principle that a lot of GMs, authors, writers, creators find that what the players see versus the totality of what can be there, it's the difference in night and day, right? The top surface of the iceberg of the surface is tiny compared to everything that's underneath. But here's the thing: just like a writer is cautioned not to info dump to get all that stuff from under the surface upwards when it's unnecessary, so too is a GM advice, and this is part of the advice about nothing exists until it hits the table, to overwork yourself about all these issues. That it's okay to world build and create characters. I mean, that's a lot of fun for a lot of people. I love to do it myself from time to time, but with the caveat that you don't have to sort of shove it in or force it up on the players. It has to come up in play, right? To a degree, of course. That doesn't mean that you don't prepare. So if you're not preparing a plot, right, a script, if you will, then what are you doing? What is actually prep? Well, there's another way of looking at this, right? Knowing that there's a less than zero chance that your players will not interact with every single thing that you've done, every map, every monster, every location, every piece of lore, etc. What you do is that you prepare a toolkit, or get a bunch of tools and get them into your toolbox so that they're ready when the players come in. For example, let's look at the town again. Why is there a town? Why? I mean, you design an adventure. Why is there a town? Well, there's a town because it's a place, a starting place, right? Uh, it's a place where it has all the conveniences that players might need, right? Blacksmith, an inn, an ale house, right? A place for quests, right? The people in town have needs that only the adventurers can fulfill, like killing giant rats in someone's basement, looking for a missing child, etc. Adventure hooks, right? If you look at it from that point of view, right, then all those things are tools. The NPCs are tools to be deployed when required. The town itself, the maps and everything that goes with town, is a tool, right? I need a town. One of the things that, for example, experienced DMs and GMs do over time is that they have, for example, a collection of maps and plans and stuff like that. So I'm playing Traveler. I need a ship. So I'm going to grab a book that has a lot of stuff. Like, okay, this is the typical explorer class ship, right? Or this is a typical cruiser ship. Boom, there it is, right? I could have had that for years and never used it until it comes up. It's like, oh, hey, there's an adventure, or the players decide we're going to assault the pirate enemies, busted cruiser ship that they're building up to, start up their campaign in the sector of piracy. We're going to go in and infiltrate it because it's crashed. So, okay, here's a map, right? It's a tool that you put up your toolbox, you put it in. It was always there. You knew about it, but you didn't need it, right? Until such time as it came up in play. It could be the central thing that the players want to do. It could be something, and this is another thing, because not only does it give you this sort of toolbox idea that you're not supposed to prep for everything, but you're supposed to have these tools ready and available when you need them, right? And that also includes NPCs, includes things breaking NPCs for their goals, motivations, and plans, i.e., their goal. What do they want to do? Their motivation. Why do they want to do it? And their plans, which includes also plans, preparations, and resources, plans and resources. How are they going to go about it, right? Do they already have all the resources available and they're just ready to implement their plan? Or are they starting up themselves and gathering allies and stuff like that, right? That creates a different situation. And again, as you play, you create these stock characters, motivations. You can go to TV tropes, for example, watch a million YouTube videos about good, bad, or different writing advice. You can get a lot of ideas from this stuff, right? You can go to, monster descriptions, like why do you have a beholder? Well, beholders are X, Y, and Z. Oh, that's a cool idea. So maybe this particular beholder is there because of this. They have their own thing going, right? And so when you put the beholder in, there's like, yeah, some beholders are just, they're fanatics and they want to destroy all things that are not done like themselves. So that's a motivation, right? It doesn't have to be every single beholder has to have that. Every single pirate has to go arg and try to, get the booty, whichever you define as the booty. But, it's there. Again, that doesn't mean that you don't write stuff, but it's better to also, because of the nature of the game, you get into the habit, instead of writing complex stories, paragraphs upon paragraphs, although people enjoy doing that, that's great. You write bullet points. You write it in a way like writing a program in BASIC. And BASIC has a statement, if then. If the players do this, then this happens. But if the players don't do this, then this. If then go to. That was a very basic, repeated part of basic programming. So if a player do this, then this happens, then you go to this. But if the players do something else, then think of an adventure more not like a script or a plot, like a flow chart. That's what I'm doing describing a flow chart. If the players do something like this, then these are the possibilities. If they didn't do this, they do that, right? And then you go from there. It allows this type of advice allows for a space between your prep and the table, a breathing room, if you will. Knowing that not all your prep is going to be used in any one situation. You could literally you could prep things for one session and never use it with this group, and then use it years later, like I mentioned before, with another group. It's like, oh, I remember that idea. Maybe this is time to deploy it, right? Also knowing that it doesn't exist until it hits the table, again takes pressure out of you and allows for the players to act, it has that space to act and have that conversation develop, right? um I tend to, for example, when I prep NPCs, only get a title, name, and maybe a picture or description. That's it. If I really want to get into it, like the big bad, right? Maybe I'm going to give them more like a motivation, goals, and stuff like that. But most characters are just there. And they only, because I know they don't exist until they hit the table, I only don't give them a voice or an attitude. Like, say, I have stock attitudes like the cowardly character, like the unreasonable character, like the angry character, like the fanatical character, right? And I just go like, let's spin the wheel. Which kind of character this character is today? Right? At least once they get that, and I proceed, right? Um, there's also other things that can be allowed for this. For example, if you think in terms of tools, if say you're doing a mystery, and depending on what kind of game you're playing, for example, if you're doing horror or even comedy, it's more restrictive. And there's some groups who actually like more what I call guided play, right? That they're like, oh, hey, Dungeon Master, just tell us, just leave the breadcrumbs and we will follow them. But most groups, even those who have that tendency from time to time, were like, you know what, I just want to do something else, right? Um, so by having the toolkit also allows you to improvise. Oh, hey, the characters discovered something much earlier in the session that I thought they wouldn't have discovered. Okay, what do I do with that? They actually, instead of killing all the baddies, they actually capture someone. That shouldn't be a surprise. But for example, depending on playing something like Dungeons and Dragons, you expect it to slay all your enemies, murder hoboing. That's a bit of a expectation. So capturing, leaving someone alive is, um, could be surprising. You'd expect in this battle, but they do capture it and they want to talk to them. Say, oh, wow, what do I do now? Oh, okay. You go to your toolbox. You pick personalities, motivations, stuff like that. It's like, okay, yeah, this character didn't exist other than a stat block of, to hit and damage and maybe a special attack or two. Now they have to have a personality, but you didn't write that. That's okay. That is fine. Because you know that there's this, again, a space between your prep and the table. And that is like, okay, well, let's roll with that. I think that's the most important thing about this piece of advice, is that it relieves the pressure. Like, did you have to have everything written down? And everything available. And it puts you in that toolkit mentality, which allows you to improv, allows you to, create things. It also allows you, because I think I mentioned this before, tabletop RPGs are a conversation. It allows you to listen to your players. Let me give you an example. Last week, I had one of the best, if not the best, role play sessions ever. And it was all combat, by the way. I had excellent players, so that helps a lot. One of the players, and this is one of the GM tricks, is like listen to what your players are saying and incorporate them, speculated something about a trap that they were doing, about some monsters that were some fire elementals. He said it out loud, and like, yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. And I proceeded to do that exactly, because I had no idea what I was doing. Essentially, what they had to do was kill the monsters, right? Very straightforward. But when they said that, I was like, that's pretty cool. That kind of makes sense. Now, a few minutes later, He said something else about some other monsters, and I say, no, 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 these monsters are there for a different reason. And I didn't change the reason why I had to change the monsters. But again, those elementals, they were fire elementals, and what they were doing, I basically took that idea from the map I put together. Well, borrowed, and I put on roll 20. And that was it. Minimal prep. I didn't come up with that idea. Had the players decided to just kill the monsters, that would have worked as well. But because I have that space between my prep and I don't know why. So I don't know why I'm still going like this. I have that space between my prep and the table and what's going to happen on the table. I didn't expect this person to say this. Once they said it, it's like, that's a great idea. I'm going to use it. It allows you to listen to your players, listen to the cadence and where the conversation is going, because usually the outer limits of any table, any game session, any game system is really what the table is willing to allow and encourage, right? Often the original term for dungeon master was referee because it was based on wargaming. So really, the idea was that the players would just go around do stuff, and you would the GM would adjudicate whether or not they were successful or not, or whether they could even try it or not, or how they could try it. Right? Again, if the players come up with novel ideas like talking to someone you didn't expect them to talk to, could be as simple as that, or try to use a spell or something that you didn't think they could use. It's going like, oh my god, I didn't pray for that. Oh, that doesn't follow the story. How do I nerf it? How do I kill it? You're like, okay, let's. You stop. You have a sort of, again, you have that space where you sort of mentally go like, okay, your conversation is here, my prep is here. There is a space. I'm going to sit in that space and I'm going to listen. It might be that the idea is completely bonkers and world breaking and all that. It's like, yeah, I'm not going to allow that, because you're going to guide the conversation away from that. But it could be a good idea, right? An innovative use. And not only that, then you can take that idea, like, boop, okay, I'm going to put it in my toolbox now. Thank you, right? Why not, right? Another thing about prep is that because people have this idea that for example, NPCs and monsters are sort of fully developed, it can lead to the idea disappointment by GMs when a monster goes down easily or becomes ineffectual. Same session later on, there's this cool monster that I based on a picture I saw from Published Adventure. If you want to know, the Published Adventure is Vecna Lives, which is not a highly rated adventure. Die Vecna Die, which is a bridging adventure between second edition and third edition, I believe, in the late 1990s, before TSR disappeared and Wizards of the Coast truly took over. That adventure, the adventure before that, had an eyeball monster. It has basically a floating eyeball, no neck, and then a body, possibly a human body, giant eyeball, and has hands. Right? I didn't take the powers and converted them from the module to fifth edition. I just took the idea and said, "Oh, what powers could a giant eyeball have? Floating eyeball, right? With the body. Well, I'll give him a claw attack because melee, and I gave him a lot of spells, some high DC, so that well, what happened was the eyeballs stared at everybody and tried to mesmerize them, tried to cause confusion, tried to do all the things, and it failed every single time because their players made the DCs, and it was a high DC 17 on wisdom, I believe, wisdom intelligence checks. I guess if I made him charisma checks, it would have been much effective. But I went for wisdom, right? If you could see through the mental haze of this mind, this creature's trying to manipulate their minds, stare into their souls. It didn't work. That's fine. That's fine. Because again, in my mindset before the game, I put all this words like, if it confronts the players, then it will do this ability. If they fail, then we go to the results of that ability. But if the power if they succeed in saving throw, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Right? it's okay. There's other abilities, and there were other creatures there as well. Like there were two other creatures. There were demons that in their opening round they were going to do what? They were going to summon more demons. Both of them failed their summons. Again, no problem, right? It's not a failure. I didn't fail because my monster didn't do all the cool things that I wanted to do. I would have loved to see them, but they didn't happen. I had other things. I had the main baddie doing some other things. Like the main baddie was supposed to do a thing, but I said, okay, if one of the players shows up, they're going to do everything in their power to take them down, right? And he was winning because it was a high level wizard with great invisibility. We used to call improved invisibility, casting a lot of spells. Eventually, they were going to run out of spells. Well, they could do something else that would help them, but they were going to run out of spells. But before that, they were going to probably kill half of the party or more. And they really did a number in the party, from fireballs, from invisibility, and some other spells. So yeah, they could do a lot of things. And so one of the players was like, oh no, I have another piece of that artifact, so I'm going to use it to that, and it worked. And they finally took them down. Great area, using area effects and all that. Again, it worked, right? And instead of being like, oh no, my monsters didn't do anything, they took my monster down in one hit. Oh my god, one round. It doesn't matter. There's many monsters happen. Let me give you another example. I had an arena fight earlier in the season, right? You can see it, by the way. This is on Raktus channel on YouTube. That's Raktus. Put it in chat. It's my Great Hawk campaign, and in that campaign, oh my god, the fights were swingy. Like the first fight was like drawn. The first fight was cool because it was a barbarian versus one-on-one fight with a barbarian versus the main fighter characters, Dragonborn, and they went at it, and they weren't like 1 inch from taking each other down. Right. The second fight, basically, I wiped the floor with the NPC that the player character that came in had a pet, and so they fought this creature, and it just. The third fight, it was completely. The third fight was also pretty even. The fourth fight, again, I had a bunch of characters that I modified, had all kinds of spells and stuff like that. Yeah, they lost very badly, and then the final fight was something different, right? Again, if you think, okay, all these characters having all these powers and abilities are possibilities, but they're not guaranteed to do anything, you don't get disappointed because you have that space, right? It's like, oh, these are cool ideas that I hope that when they hit the table, I will be able to implement, right? And there's also another thing where the player characters were supposed, one of the things they actually, instead of saying supposed, they were capable of saying, because they were on the heavy guard between the fights, to sneak around and go, okay, I'm going to try to investigate what's going on, right? And they did some questions and all that, but they didn't like sneak, right? They didn't take that, right? That's fine. And some people might say, investigation, monsters, fights, that's not familiar. Yeah, it's a path, not a pathfinder, adventure path. Part of an adventure path called the Age of Worms, but I just adapted a piece of it halfway through the adventure path. Check it out, by the way. It's a great adventure path for Dungeons and Dragons, and you can also use it in Pathfinder as well. Anyway, it's called Age of Worms. If you can find it, it's awesome. Anyway, they didn't do that because they were like, yeah, we're heavily guarded. It's too very risky. We're not going to take the risk. Eventually, they kind of did. And so there was a fight where they had to do, right? And so there was an alternative. They actually could stop or slow down what was about to happen, but they didn't. So something else happened, right? I think that's what people think about when they think of plots is like, oh, the big bad has his plot, and if the players don't interfere with it, then it's going to happen. No, don't call that a plot. Call that a plan. The big bad has a plan, and that's based on their motivations and their goals, right? And that they're going to do their thing, right? And how well aware the players are about it, you give them a chance. You don't give a chance. You encourage them, like, hey, listen, you could try, right? Investigate, or you can just fight it out, right? Why? Because the players had their own agenda was to win the combat, get as much money as possible, so they could go back home and build their own stronghold. So they had their motivation, which didn't necessarily follow one to one with the motivation of the the bad guy. And then there was another character who was investigating something else, and I have to admit I did give them a bit of a runaround. Not fair, right? But eventually it linked back to the stuff that was happening in the arena, right? And so that's what happens. Also, another thing is, if you were thinking, "Oh, I have to deliver all the plot stuff like that," what happens to characters' backstory? A lot of player characters, and myself included, like to write not necessarily elaborate backstories, but we like to write backstories, at least a page or so, that has plot hooks of our own, things the character, hints or outright says the motivations of the character, etc. If you're thinking in terms of I have to, heap on the plot, as it were, you're not giving space for the players and their backstory. It often happens that the backstory never comes up because it doesn't fit with what you already written. Change it. Because the moment the player says, I'm going to do this, and it's based on my backstory, it's like, well, that is far more real and present than your prep. That's something the characters are doing now, at the moment. It's like, I'm going to go and try to get a magical item because I want to improve myself, right? Like there's two characters that have backstories that I've sort of integrated into the big bad story and the whole thing that's going on. But again, I'd be able to do that because I have that space to listen to what they want to do, right? And, weave them together. Because here's the thing. Ultimately, whatever story comes from the game, it comes from the game. It doesn't come exclusively from what you present. And I think this also comes a lot from people playing published adventures. And the tendency of published adventures is you read a published adventure and so, oh, this has to go this way. Again, think of a published adventure as a pre-packaged toolkit, if you will, right? It's like if I were to, like a first aid kit, right? It's a kit for applying first aid. That's what a pre-packaged, that's a module. That's why I like to use the term module, because a pre-published adventure has more hints of a novel or story. And some writers, in fact, one way to tell a bad pre-published adventure versus a good one is that the pre-published adventure does not leave any room for characters going off the rails. Mind you, I'll talk about off the rails probably in another video, but suffice it to say that if you're thinking of, again, I'll repeat it one more time, nothing exists until it hits the table. That means that there are no rails to be derailed, if you will, right? Oh, they're going off script. There isn't any script. Because here's the thing. Many people describe tabletop RPGs as cooperative storytelling, right? Well, the story doesn't come exclusively or even mainly from one player, being the GM. It comes from everybody doing their bit, and together a story emerges. The story of a role-playing game is the story of what happened in the game. The story of a role-playing game is what happened during the campaign or the entire campaign. What the players did or failed to do, including the GM, but not exclusively. Remember, you're numbered again, 2-1, 3-1, 4-1, 5-1. Even if you're playing 1-1 solo, which solo games are actually two people. It's a weird term. Again, you never know what's going to happen. A dice roll can go one way. You also forget stuff. That's another thing. It's like if you forget something, unless it's incredibly vital at the moment, useful at that moment, you can change it somewhere else. Like, okay, well, I forgot about thing. My prep. Okay, here's my toolkit. I can throw something else, right? Something else. I throw in something else. I had to enunciate. That would be very helpful for people to understand what I'm talking about. So, that is something that I think is very important. That's where the main best stories come from. What happens on the table, right? There's a story by Seth Sarakowski, who does a lot of reviews for Traveler, Cthulhu, and Dungeons and Dragons mostly, and Cyberpunk 2020. A story by Cyberpunk 2020, which became a very memorable story, and it came about because it was sort of like a thrown together thing. He had a location, he had a simple mission for the players to do, and then an NPC came out of nowhere, and he sort of created the NPC as it went along. He took his toolkit as an experienced GM and coupled the this NPC, a minor NPC, out of nowhere, because the NPC existed because it came out of a plan that the players had. Essentially, the players wanted to, vacate this empty or apparently abandoned warehouse, and one of them asked a simple question: does this warehouse, this building, have a for sale sign? And if it does, what's the company? Do they have a phone number? Like, yes, they do. The name of the company, if you know about the person I'm talking about, is called, the name of the company, Scott's Brown. So say, okay, we're going to call them. They're going to come in. They're going to, have a showing. We're going to schedule a showing that should scare or drive these punks out of this building. And then we grab the people we're going to grab, etc. All that was improvised, or most of it, right? It came from the players. Now, the players could have done anything. The players could have done very tactically and, repel from the ceiling and thrown, flashbang grenades, or try to infiltrate and post as a rival gang member or somebody who wants to join the gang and talk their way through it. Whatever. That's fine. But they asked a simple question. They got a simple answer, which led to a very memorable moment. You can't really plan for those things. You cannot anticipate that the players are going to go, hey, most buildings are not really abandoned. They're usually for sale. Don't we know anybody who would actually buy this, right? They could, that's another thing. Again, improvisation and allowing to listen to the players. If you're focusing on your prep, right? If you're focusing on your plot, the tendency is not to derail yourself because you want to stay on plot. So it's like, if you didn't prep for Scott's Brown agent to come in and have a showing, and people who might listen to this might go like, I know what you're talking about. It's a very funny story, by the way. I'll probably put it in the YouTube version on the link because it's a fantastic story. And Seth Sarakowski does a great job in illustrating it. That would never have happened, because the thing is, like, I didn't think about a for sale sign. Oh yeah, you call and nothing happens. It's a disconnected number or something. Like, you try to steer the players back into your plot. And again, there is no plot. There is no story yet. You have the pieces. Think yourself not as a director. Think yourself as a set designer, an FX expert, right? People do the fireworks, etc. An editor, if you will, post story, right? The editing is the soul of movies, as they say, right? You're all those things, but the one thing you're not is not a director. You're not a producer. You're not the big guy. You got to stand there and say this, right? And you don't ask the players what's your motivation. The players come to you as like, this is my motivation, because they want to play their characters. You're just one player on the table as part of a much larger, using my hands to describe this, conversation. Okay? Give yourself that space to forget, to change things, to listen to your players. Give yourself the space that says nothing exists until it hits the table. So that's all I have for tonight in this relatively brief stream. I'm still working on some more stuff, including a review of Kingdoms and Warfare. Should be coming out hopefully this week. I gotta finish reading it, of course, and reviewing it, and more D&D streams, and also a couple of things I'm having my eye on. So new games are coming up, so streaming. So thank you, ready for coming, and as always, we'll see you. Bye bye, everybody.